The kitchen clock Julia Bennett inherited from her mother ticked like a metronome for a life she no longer recognized. It hung above the window that faced their quiet Texas street, a neat row of mailboxes bathed in the last smear of dusk. Julia sat alone at the table, hands folded around a cooling mug of coffee, listening to a house that refused to tell the truth. The refrigerator hummed. The air vents sighed. Somewhere down the hall, the old hardwood let out a tired creak, as if the past itself were shifting its weight. Julian came in late the way he did now, keys rattling, tie tugged half loose, a performance of fatigue that had grown too polished to be real. He kissed the air near her cheek, shrugged his suit jacket onto the back of a chair, and mumbled something about contractors in Dallas. His cologne drifted through the room, expensive and familiar, but tonight it carried a sweet floral echo that did not belong to her. It floated behind him like a confession. He didn't notice the way Julia's fingers tightened around the mug. He didn't see her eyes slide to the hall where his phone face down on a side table pulsed with a soft, steady glow. He just disappeared to the bedroom shoes thumping dully, and a minute later the mattress groaned. Within 5, he was snoring gentle content, the sound of a man who'd made peace with his secrets. Julia rose, her movements small and exact. 40 years of marriage had taught her how to be quiet. She lifted his jacket and smoothed the shoulders with the care of a habit she could no longer feel. The pockets held only a linted receipt, a mint, a hotel pen. She set them in a tidy line, as if neatness could will honesty back into the room. The phone's screen blinked again. She told herself to leave it. She told herself she was better than this. But the clock ticked and the glow nagged like a toothache. She exhaled and tapped it awake. There, above a field of empty notifications, sat a new email, short, sloppy, intimate. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." A red heart stamped at the end like a bruise. For a second, her breath forgot how to move. Then it arrived all at once, a rush that left her dizzy, listening to nothing and everything. The clock, the vents, the memory of her mother's hands dusted with flour, and her own younger voice daring to believe in forever. Dad. The word felt wrong in her mouth. Who wrote it like that? Why the heart? She scrolled for context and found none a throwaway address, no thread, no history. A message from nowhere cutting a seam down the middle of her life. She put the phone back as if it might bite. The kitchen swam. She made herself rinse a plate, wipe a counter-rinse again, domestic choreography as prayer. When her pulse steadied, she gathered the rest of Julian's things, wallet keys, the older laptop he kept for simple stuff. The keys chimed softly against her palm, and something like instinct tugged her toward the garage. His SUV parked inside carried the day's heat in its seats. Julia slid into the driver's side and let the stillness settle around her. The glove box stuck, then popped with a sigh. Loose change, registration, a tube plastic slick familiar in the way of things married people stop needing to name. Personal lubricant used, the cap gummy with residue. Julia's throat tightened, but no sound came. She set it down carefully, like a fragile artifact excavated from a ruin. They hadn't been intimate in years. He'd apologized with a sad smile and a pat on her hand, age work stress. She'd believed him. She'd turned her energy toward the ovens, the early mornings, the bakery that kept their lights on, and their son through college. She'd told herself love just changes costume. Under the back seat, crumpled napkins, the faint, defiant ghost of that floral perfume. She took photos with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Evidence she thought, or a map out of denial. When she returned the items to their exact places, she wiped the glove box with the hem of her cardigan until it shone. Back inside, she paused in the doorway to watch Julian's sleep mouth open. Blanket half kicked away the soft, oblivious rhythm of a man who counted on the world to catch him. The tenderness that rose in her surprised and angered her all at once. She wasn't made for vengeance. She was made for keeping things alive, yeast and hope, and families that forgot how to say thank you. But the clock ticked. The email glowed in the dark behind her eyes. The tube sat in the garage like a dare. Julia set his keys down beside the phone aligned to the edge of the table. Then she pulled her own phone from her apron pocket and opened the camera roll, checking each picture. When she was done, she found a number Mrs. Peterson mentioned years ago and typed a message with the precision of a woman icing a cake she intended to cut in half. "My name is Julia Bennett. I need to know the truth. If you're with me, tap like, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and follow, because the truth is coming and it won't whisper." The next morning, Julia woke before the sun, her pillow still warm from dreams she couldn't remember. She moved through the house like a ghost shower coffee apron. The smell of toast filled the kitchen, but she didn't taste it. Every sound, the squeak of the faucet, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator felt amplified like the house itself was holding its breath. Julian had already left for work, or so he said. He'd kissed the top of her head, murmured a half-hearted, "Don't wait up," and disappeared into the pale morning fog. The door had barely clicked shut when Julia felt her composure dissolve. She stood there, hands still resting on the countertop, and whispered to no one, "You're not fooling me anymore." At 9 sharp, she called Mrs. Peterson. Her neighbor's soft southern voice carried the kind of concern that made Julia's chest ache. "Sweetheart, Mrs. Peterson said you sound like you ain't slept in a week. What's going on?" "I need that number," Julia replied quietly. "The private investigator you mentioned once, Thomas, was it?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind that came before truth. "Oh, Julia," Mrs. Peterson sighed. "I hoped you'd never need it. I'll text it to you right now." By noon, Julia was sitting in a small cafe downtown. The place smelled of espresso and cinnamon, and the hum of conversation mixed with the hiss of steaming milk. She chose the corner table back against the wall, habit born of survival, not comfort. Every time the door opened, she looked up. Her heart jumped when a man with graying hair and a neatly pressed blue shirt entered, scanning the room. "Mrs. Bennett?" he asked softly, approaching her table. "Yes," Julia said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "You must be Thomas." He nodded, taking the seat across from her. His eyes were calm but not cold, the kind that had seen too many betrayals to flinch at another. Julia reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive, sliding it across the table like contraband. "These are photos," she explained. "Receipts, emails, things I found. I think my husband is cheating on me." Thomas looked at her for a moment, not with pity but with quiet respect. "You're not the first woman to sit here like this," he said gently, "but you might be one of the few who's ready to face what comes next." She nodded. "I just need the truth, whatever it is." He opened a small notebook, jotting down her address. Julian's work details, his license plate number. His handwriting was small, precise, like a man who left nothing to chance. "I'll start this afternoon," he promised. "You'll hear from me soon." Julia drove home through the long Texas afternoon, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The sun burned across the windshield, and for the first time in years, she noticed how old her hands looked, thin, freckled, lined by years of kneading dough and wiping tears in secret. By the time she reached the bakery, her nerves had settled into something heavier, colder resolve. She buried herself in work until late evening. The smell of baking bread usually soothed her, but today it only reminded her of the 40 years she'd spent building something while Julian built his lies. Each loaf that came out of the oven felt like proof of her loyalty and of his betrayal. When she finally turned off the lights and headed home, the street was quiet. The house looked peaceful from the outside, its windows glowing soft and golden. But when she stepped inside, it felt like stepping into an abandoned church. Julian's things were where he'd left them, his shoes by the door, his jacket draped on the couch, his phone charging on the counter. A life continuing as if nothing were broken. Julia sat on the edge of the couch, staring at that phone. For the first time, she realized she didn't care what lies it might hold. Soon, she'd have real proof. Soon, she'd know. It was nearly midnight when her phone vibrated. The message preview on the screen made her heart skip. Thomas Green. "Mrs. Bennett, I think you were right. Call me first thing in the morning." Her stomach dropped. She dialed him immediately, but it went to voicemail. She didn't sleep that night, only sat in the dark, the old clock ticking louder than ever. At sunrise, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo. Julian stood outside a fancy restaurant, the kind they used to go to when they still celebrated anniversaries. He wasn't alone. A woman was with him, her hand tucked in his. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, smiling up at him. Julia's blood turned to ice. It was Allison, her daughter-in-law. She zoomed in, hoping she was wrong, but the truth was cruelly clear. That soft golden hair, the delicate earrings Julia had given her last Christmas, the dress she'd worn to Daniel's promotion dinner, it was all there, undeniable. The photo blurred as Julia's eyes filled with tears. She pressed a shaking hand to her lips, trying not to make a sound. Her son's wife, her husband, together. In one moment, every illusion of family shattered. The life she'd built, the bakery, the love, the sacrifices, it all turned to dust. And in the hollow silence that followed, something inside her hardened. Julia Bennett was no longer the quiet wife who waited for the truth to reveal itself. She would dig it out, expose it, and burn every lie to the ground. Julia stared at the photograph until the colors began to blur. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock were the only sounds in the house. Yet the silence roared in her ears. Her body was still, but her mind was racing back through decades of laughter, arguments, and small kindnesses that now felt like a performance. 40 years of her life rewritten in a single frame, her husband and her daughter-in-law, their hands joined in the soft light of a restaurant they once loved. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Thomas. "Thomas, I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett. I have a video. You should see it for yourself." Julia hesitated. She didn't want to press play, but she did. The video was grainy shot from across the street. The camera followed Julian and Allison as they exited the restaurant, their bodies leaning toward each other. He opened the car door for her, his hand resting on her back. She laughed, touching his arm in a way no daughter-in-law should. For a moment he brushed her hair from her face, tender and familiar. Then they kissed. Julia gasped softly. Her throat felt raw, as if she'd swallowed smoke. She turned off the phone and pressed it face down against the table. The room swayed, and she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the intimacy of it, the ease, the quiet comfort between them. Julian hadn't looked at her that way in years. The man who once toasted her at candlelit dinners, who helped her hang the bakery's first sign, who promised her they'd grow old together, that man was gone. And the woman who had replaced her in his life was the same one she had once called family. Her memories began to rearrange themselves, pieces of the puzzle now falling into sinister alignment. Allison's distant glances during family dinners, her excuses to drop something off for Dad at the house when Daniel was on shift, Julian's sudden trips to San Antonio for business. Julia wanted to scream, but there was no one to hear it. The betrayal was so obscene, so unthinkable, that even her pain felt private. The next morning, the bakery was busy. Regular customers filled the air with small talk and the smell of fresh pastries. Julia moved through her tasks as if nothing had changed, measuring sugar, stirring batter, smiling mechanically. The routine kept her upright, but every clink of the metal spoon against the bowl sounded like a reminder they're laughing somewhere while you're still working to keep this family alive. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't take the noise anymore. She retreated to her small office in the back, closed the door, and sat with her head in her hands. She thought about calling Daniel her son, her pride, her only child. But how could she? How could she tell him that the two people he loved most had destroyed him? She pictured his face when he found out, and her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. When the bakery finally closed, she sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The sky outside was streaked with orange and pink. She didn't drive home right away. Instead, she parked in the empty lot behind the building and called Thomas. "Miss Bennett," he answered quietly, as if he already knew what she was feeling. "I need you to keep following them," she said. Her voice was steady now, frighteningly calm. "I want everything: dates, places, conversations, who they meet, what they say." There was a pause. "Are you sure you want to know all of that?" "I've lived 40 years in the dark," she said. "I can handle the light." 2 days later, Thomas sent another file. This time, audio. Julia sat at the kitchen table, headphones in her hands, trembling as she pressed play. The recording was muffled at first, but then Allison's voice became clear, smooth, confident, cold. You'll get the documents signed, right? Once we transfer the bakery ownership she's done, that old woman won't even see it coming. Then Julian's voice, calm and certain. Leave it to me. Julia trusts me completely. I'll take care of everything. Julia ripped the headphones out, her pulse pounding in her ears. She stared at the screen, unable to move. So it wasn't just an affair, it was a plan. They weren't content with betraying her heart. They wanted to steal her life's work. The bakery, the business she had built from scratch, the one she had sacrificed her youth and health for. They wanted that too. She felt a strange clarity settle over her like ice forming on a lake. No more tears, no more denial. Her marriage was already ashes, now they wanted to scatter them. In the living room, Julian's laughter drifted from the TV, oblivious, careless. He was watching one of his old westerns, the same ones they used to watch together. She studied his profile from the doorway, his thinning hair, his heavy frame, the lines around his eyes that she once found comforting. How many nights had she believed his lies? How many times had she prayed he'd come home safe, cooked his favorite meals, washed his shirts, covered for his failures? Now, as she stood there, something shifted deep inside her. It wasn't hate. It was justice, cold and methodical. She realized she no longer wanted his explanations or his apologies. She wanted balance. Julia walked quietly back to the kitchen, her mind already moving faster than her fear. On the counter lay her tools of habit, flour, sugar, yeast. She reached instead for the toolbox she kept under the sink. Inside, among old nails and screws, was a small tube of industrial-strength glue she had once used to fix a broken stool in the bakery. She held it in her hand for a long time, the label catching the kitchen light. It wasn't just a tool anymore, it was the beginning of an answer. The following morning, Julia Bennett woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The fear, the disbelief, the trembling hands, all of it had vanished, replaced by something colder, steadier. She moved through her house with a deliberate calm, like a woman preparing for a ceremony she alone understood. Julian sat at the breakfast table, flipping through his phone, pretending to check emails. His tie was crooked, his eyes bleary, his voice too casual. "Big day," he muttered between sips of coffee. "A new business partner from out of town?" Julia nodded, pretending to be half listening. She could read him too well now, the slight nervous blink, the overdone smile, the faint tension in his shoulders. Every lie he told added another layer to her resolve. "I'll be out of town tomorrow," she said softly as she set a plate of toast in front of him. "Nashville. I'm signing a new contract for the bakery expansion. I might not be home until late." He looked up surprised, then smiled a little too easily. "Really? That's great news, sweetheart." His tone was syrupy, his relief barely hidden. "You've earned it." "Yeah," she said quietly. "I guess I have." When he left for work, Julia followed him to the window, watching his car disappear down the street. The second he was gone, she picked up her phone and called Thomas. "Follow him one more day," she said. "I have a feeling he's going to be busier than usual." Thomas didn't ask questions. "I'll update you tonight," he replied. That evening, the sky turned deep orange and Julia's house glowed warm and harmless from the outside, like any suburban home on a quiet Texas street. But inside, something dangerous was unfolding. She laid out everything on the kitchen counter, the industrial superglue, a small funnel, a clean towel. Each item placed with the precision of a baker measuring ingredients. She unscrewed the cap of the lubricant tube she had found in Julian's glove compartment days earlier. Her fingers didn't shake. She emptied its contents into the sink, washed it, dried it, and slowly began refilling it with the clear, viscous glue. Drop by drop, her breathing synced with the slow rhythm of her work. When it was full, she pressed the cap back on, wiped the edges clean, and held it to the light. It looked exactly the same. She allowed herself a small, grim smile. Not of joy, but of control. After 40 years of being the one who forgave, who endured, who swallowed her pride for the sake of family, she was finally doing something for herself. She placed the tube back where she'd found it in the glove compartment of Julian's car, right under the registration papers. Then she carefully adjusted the seat and floor mat to the exact positions they had been before. That night, Julia lay in bed beside him, pretending to sleep. She could feel the warmth of his body, hear his breathing deepen. He smelled faintly of cologne again, and something floral. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady ticking of that old clock in the hallway. At midnight, when Julian's snoring paused, she heard the faint click of his phone unlocking. His whisper broke the silence. "Yeah, tomorrow's perfect. She's leaving early. Come by around 10. No hotels this time." Allison's voice on the other end was a soft, excited giggle. "Finally, Dad. I'll bring the wine." Julia shut her eyes, her hands gripping the sheet so tightly the fabric twisted. He turned off the phone and slipped back under the covers, unaware that the woman beside him had heard every word. When his breathing steadied again, Julia got out of bed and went to her son's old room. In the back of a drawer, she found what she needed, a small voice recorder Daniel had once used for his firefighting training. She replaced the batteries, tested the sound, and hid it behind a row of books on the bedroom shelf near the headboard. It was angled perfectly toward the bed. She checked it twice, making sure the tiny red light was hidden by the photo frame of Daniel's wedding, Julian's arm around her shoulders, Allison's smile bright and deceptive. She almost laughed. The photo was now part of the disguise. When she returned to bed, the recorder was already running. She lay there in the dark, feeling the quiet pulse of her heart against the sheets. By dawn, she had everything planned. She rose early, made breakfast, and packed a small overnight bag with fake contracts and old business receipts, proof, if anyone saw her leave, that she was going to Nashville. Julian came downstairs half-dressed, pretending to rush. "You sure you'll be all right on your own?" she asked, masking her voice in gentle domestic concern. He waved dismissively. "Of course. Go sign your deal, boss lady." She smiled. "All right then. Don't wait up." Before stepping out, she paused by the kitchen stove. She tied a thin string to the gas lighter and threaded it through the small crack of the window toward the counter, where she placed an old coffee tin as an anchor. Inside the pan on the stove, she poured a shallow pool of oil. It wasn't enough to burn the house down, just enough to smoke when ignited. A simple distraction. A signal. When everything was set, she took her purse and walked out, locking the door behind her. Across the street, Miss Peterson was watering her plants. "Heading out so early, Julia?" she asked. "Business trip," Julia said with a polite smile. "Would you mind keeping an eye on the house today?" "Of course, dear," Mrs. Peterson replied. "Safe travels." Julia thanked her, crossed the street, and stepped inside her neighbor's home instead of heading to the bus station. She sat by the window with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching her own front door in silence. The trap was set. All she needed now was time. At precisely 10 o'clock, a taxi slowed in front of Julia's house. From Mrs. Peterson's lace-curtained window across the street, Julia watched as Allison stepped out dressed like a woman who believed the world belonged to her. A light floral dress hugged her figure, a wide-brimmed hat shielded her face, and her lips glowed a deep shade of red. Even from a distance, Julia could sense her confidence, the kind only people without conscience possessed. Julian appeared at the door a moment later, glancing up and down the street like a thief. When he was sure no one was watching, he ushered Allison inside. The door closed, and the quiet street returned to stillness, except for the faint whistle of wind brushing against the trees. Julia's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Her pulse was steady, her face calm, but inside her chest a slow, relentless storm gathered. Through her phone, she could hear everything, the faint hum from the recorder she'd hidden in the bedroom. Footsteps. Laughter. The sound of 2 glasses clinking. "All right," Julian's voice said through the static, warm and low. "No more sneaking around. She's gone for the day." Allison laughed softly. "About time, Dad. You really outdid yourself this time." Julia pressed the phone tighter to her ear, her eyes closed. It was one thing to suspect another to hear it. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was alive, breathing, filling the air she once called home. Minutes passed. Then came the unmistakable rhythm of a bed frame creaking, followed by a gasp. Allison's voice sharp and startled. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked suddenly. "We're stuck." Julia opened her eyes. The world outside was unchanged, birds on the wires, a dog barking somewhere down the block, but inside her house, chaos had begun. "What do you mean, stuck?" Julian's voice snapped, alarmed. "Stop moving, just hold still. I can't." "It's burning. It hurts." Julia's lips curved, not in joy, but in grim acknowledgement. She picked up the string she had tied to the stove's igniter and pulled gently. The click of the lighter was faint, but a moment later, black smoke began curling through the kitchen window. It wasn't fire, just oil and smoke thick enough to crawl up the curtains to drift through the air vents to be seen from the street. Mrs. Peterson gasped beside her. "Julia, your house, it's smoking." Julia forced a convincing panic. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Call 911. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, pointing, shouting. "Fire! It's the Bennett's house!" And then Julia saw it, the fire truck turning the corner, red lights flashing. Her stomach clenched as she recognized the man jumping out first, Daniel. Her son. Her boy in his uniform commanding his crew with urgency. "Get the hoses ready," Daniel shouted. There might be people inside. Julia's breath caught. She hadn't planned for him to be the one to respond, hadn't even thought about it. She watched helplessly as he kicked down the front door and ran into the smoke. Inside the house, muffled voices erupted, panic, confusion, shouting. Through her headphones, Julia heard Allison sobbing and Julian swearing in pain. Then Daniel's voice, strained and horrified. "What? What is this?" The recording crackled and Julia's heart splintered. She could picture the scene without seeing it, her son frozen in the doorway of the bedroom staring at the nightmare before him. His father and his wife trapped together, tangled in humiliation. "Chief, we've got 2 people in here," one firefighter yelled. They're stuck. "Oh my God," another voice muttered. "Are they naked?" "Silence," Daniel barked, but his tone broke halfway through the word. Julia closed her eyes. She could hear the chaos spilling from her home now, the footsteps, the shouts, the murmurs from neighbors gathering outside. The words spread like wildfire. "Who's inside?" someone asked. "It's Julian Bennett and his daughter-in-law." Another answered, disbelief dripping from every syllable. Together, the murmurs turned into gasps, gasps into outrage, outrage into laughter. Phones lifted into the air as people began filming. The neighborhood that once praised Julia's family for their success now turned into a chorus of whispers and judgment. When the firefighters carried them out, Julian and Allison, covered with a thin white sheet, faces twisted in pain and shame, the crowd erupted. Someone muttered, "Disgusting." Another said, "Poor Julia. She didn't deserve this." Daniel followed behind, his face pale, his jaw locked, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Julia stood among the onlookers, pretending to arrive late, her purse clutched against her chest. Mrs. Peterson's hand squeezed her arm in sympathy. "Julia, I'm so sorry," she whispered. Julia didn't respond, her gaze fixed on Julian, her husband, once so proud and charming, reduced now to a trembling wreck under a sheet, his eyes darting everywhere but at her. Allison sobbed beside him, mascara streaked down her face, her hair tangled, her humiliation complete. The firefighters lifted them onto stretchers and into the waiting ambulance. The siren wailed, carrying them away. As the vehicle disappeared down the street, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the whispers lingered like smoke. Daniel remained standing in the yard long after everyone else had gone, staring at the house that had been his childhood home, now tainted forever. Julia watched him from across the street, her heart breaking and hardening all at once. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to say, "I'm sorry you had to see this." But she couldn't. This was the price of truth. She turned to Mrs. Peterson and murmured, "I should go to the hospital." Her neighbor nodded silently, understanding more than Julia would ever say out loud. As they walked toward her car, the last curls of smoke drifted into the morning sky, dissolving slowly like a secret that had finally burned itself away. The hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bleaching the world into a pale blur. Julia sat on the stiff plastic chair outside the emergency ward, her hands folded in her lap, her purse balanced neatly beside her. Her clothes still carried the faintest trace of smoke, a ghost of what had burned hours ago. Not a house, not really, but a family. Mrs. Peterson sat quietly next to her, whispering prayers under her breath. Around them, nurses hurried past, doctors called for charts, and phones rang with lives breaking open in other rooms. But for Julia, the noise came from far away. Her world had narrowed to a single door, the one that hid Julian and Allison. When the door finally opened, a nurse stepped out, sweat shining on her forehead. "Mrs. Bennett?" she asked softly. Julia rose. Her voice was even. "Yes. They're going to be fine," the nurse said. "No major injuries, some skin irritation, dehydration, but they're stable." Irritation. Julia repeated the word strange in her mouth. There were so many words for what had happened, but fine wasn't one of them. "They'll be moved to room 314 soon," the nurse continued. "They asked for privacy." Julia nodded. "I'll bring them something to help with the burns." The nurse smiled sympathetically, the way strangers do when they think they're comforting you. "You're a good wife, ma'am. A forgiving one." Julia didn't answer. She waited until the nurse walked away, then opened her purse and took out 2 small tubes. The labels looked identical to the hospital ointment she'd seen before, Whitecap's blue lettering, but inside they weren't ointment. They were thick mustard she had prepared earlier just in case. Mrs. Peterson turned to her, frowning. "Julia," she whispered. "You don't have to." Julia met her eyes. "They made their choices," she said quietly. "Now I'm making mine." She walked down the hall without looking back. Room 314 was small and dim, the blinds drawn halfway. Julian lay in one bed, pale and trembling, his hand wrapped in gauze. Allison sat beside him, hair tangled, eyes red and swollen from crying. When Julia entered, the air changed the way it does when a storm passes through a church. Allison's voice broke first. "Julia, please. I'm sorry." "I don't know what." Julia held up her hand, silencing her. "Save it. You don't owe me an explanation, Allison. I've already heard everything I need." Julian tried to sit up. "Julia, listen to me. It wasn't what you think. I made a mistake." She turned her gaze to him, steady and sharp. "You made many mistakes, Julian. I was there for every one of them. This is just the first one I let you feel." He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. His voice collapsed under the weight of her calm. "I brought this," she said, setting the 2 tubes on the side table. "For the burns." Julian's hand twitched toward them, hesitant. Julia smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides a lifetime of unshed tears. "Don't worry," she said softly. "It'll help." She turned and left before either of them could speak. Minutes later, she was back in the hallway when the first scream tore through the air, Allison's voice high and desperate. "It burns! Oh my God, it burns!" Then Julian's furious shout, "What the hell is this, nurse? Somebody help us!" The door flew open, nurses rushing in, voices overlapping in confusion. Julia stayed seated, her expression unreadable while chaos bloomed inside the room. One nurse shouted for saline, another for water. The mustard's heat was harmless compared to the inferno of humiliation that had already consumed them, but the scene was enough. Soon, patients and visitors crowded the hallway, whispering. "That's them," someone murmured, "the father-in-law and the daughter-in-law, the ones from the fire." "I saw the video online," another said. "They deserve every bit of this." Julia kept her eyes on her folded hands, her face composed, almost peaceful. When the noise finally began to fade, a doctor stepped out of the room, wiping his forehead. He looked at her with something like pity. "They're stable again," he said. "Someone must have mixed up the ointment. We've cleaned it up." "Good," Julia said simply. "Thank you, doctor." A shadow fell across the floor. Daniel stood there, still in his uniform, his face drawn and pale. His hands hung limp at his sides, his eyes hollow. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "They told me you were here." Julia rose slowly. For the first time that day, her composure faltered. "Daniel." He shook his head. "I saw everything, Mom. Everything." His words were low, steady, and devastating. I had to pull them out myself. I can't." He stopped as if speech itself had become too heavy. Julia stepped forward, wanting to reach for him, but he flinched slightly, not from anger but from pain too deep to name. "I didn't mean for you to," she began, her voice breaking. Daniel closed his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, "but it doesn't change what I saw." For a moment they stood there, mother and son, two survivors in the ruins of their own home. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "You didn't start this, Mom." "They did, but it's over now. Let it be over." Julia nodded slowly, though inside she knew it wasn't over, not yet. The house could be rebuilt, the bakery could run, but the family she had spent 40 years holding together was gone. Daniel walked away down the corridor, his shadow long and tired under the harsh hospital lights. Julia watched him disappear, her hands clasped tight against her chest. Somewhere inside room 314 she could still hear muffled crying, but she didn't look back. She had already buried enough ghosts for one lifetime. The next morning, sunlight leaked through the blinds of Julia's kitchen, falling across the same table where just days ago she had discovered her husband's betrayal. The house smelled faintly of burnt oil and lemon cleaner, a sterile attempt to erase what could never be forgotten. She sat in her chair, still wearing the cardigan she'd thrown on the night before, her eyes fixed on the empty cup in front of her. Across the table lay a manila envelope. Inside it was everything that remained of 40 years of marriage photographs, recordings, printed screenshots, and now 2 freshly prepared documents that Thomas Green had delivered that morning. Divorce papers, property transfer authorization, her bakery, her home, her independence, secured finally in her own name. The knock on the door came at 10:30. It was Daniel. His uniform was gone. Today he was simply her son. His eyes were red from sleeplessness, his expression unreadable. Julia opened the door and tried to smile, but the effort trembled and broke halfway. "Come in," she said softly. He stepped inside, silent. For a long moment they simply stood there in the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the distance between them. Daniel's gaze wandered over the walls, family photos, wedding portraits, a framed certificate from Julia's first bakery, the life he thought he knew. "I went to see them this morning," he said, finally, his voice low and heavy. "The hospital moved them to a private room." Julia swallowed. "How are they?" He hesitated. "Alive, miserable." His lips pressed into a thin line. "The staff won't stop whispering." The other patients stare. "Allison, she tried to talk to me, but I couldn't." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I can't, Mom. Not yet." Julia nodded, folding her hands together on the table. "You don't have to. Some wounds shouldn't be spoken over." He sat down across from her. "What are you going to do?" She slid the manila envelope toward him. "End it." Daniel looked down at the document, scanning the first few lines. His fingers brushed over his father's name, his wife's name, his mother's signature. His throat worked hard before he spoke again. "You've already signed them." "I have," she said. "He'll sign them too. Today. Do you really think he will?" Julia's eyes hardened. "After what happened, he'll have no choice." 2 hours later, Julia walked into St. Mary's with her head high, the envelope tucked under her arm. Nurses and patients glanced up as she passed, whispers trailing behind her like shadows. Everyone knew who she was now, the woman whose husband and daughter-in-law had turned shame into spectacle. Outside room 314, she paused. Through the door, she could hear low voices, Allison's muffled sobs, Julian's impatient muttering. Julia pushed the door open. The room fell silent. Allison turned her face toward the wall, but Julia caught the glimpse of swollen eyes and bandaged arms. Julian looked worse, his face gray, the proud lines of his jaw slack with defeat. "Julia," he said, his voice rough. "You didn't have to come." "I did," she replied, stepping closer. "There are things that need to be finished." She set the envelope on the tray between their beds and opened it carefully. The papers slid out crisp and final. 40 years of marriage, she said quietly. 40 years of work, lies, and sacrifices. I built our life, Julian. I built the bakery that paid our bills, that kept us standing. And this," she tapped the top page, "this is where it ends." Allison started to cry again, a small broken sound. "Julia, I swear I never meant for any of this." "Don't," Julia said, her tone flat. "You meant every moment. You thought you were clever, that he'd protect you. But people like you forget nothing stays hidden forever." Julian's hands clenched the bedsheet. "Julia, please. We were stupid, but I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't mean to get caught," she interrupted. "That's what you didn't mean." He looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I've lost everything." Julia exhaled slowly. "No, Julian. You lost me long ago. You just didn't notice until now." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of machines beeping filled the void between them. Then Julia reached into her bag, pulled out a pen, and placed it next to the papers. "Sign them," she said. "And when you do, you can disappear. I don't care where you go. Just stay away from me and from Daniel." He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with something that wasn't quite regret. "Daniel hates me," he murmured. "No," Julia replied. "He's grieving. He's mourning the father he thought he had." Julian reached for the pen with trembling fingers and scrawled his signature across both pages. The sound of the ballpoint scratching against paper was the quietest sound Julia had ever heard, and the most final. When he was done, she gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and slipped them back into the envelope. She turned to Allison. "You'll leave too," she said softly. "You'll sign your divorce papers and walk away from my son. You don't deserve another chance at his life." Allison nodded weakly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I understand." Julia looked at her for a long time, not with anger anymore, but with an exhausted kind of pity. "You don't," she said at last. "But one day you will." She turned toward the door. Julian called her name once, softly. "Julia," he said. "After all this, do you still hate me?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "No," she said quietly. "I don't hate you. Hate would mean I still care." Then she left the room, closing the door behind her. Outside, the hallway was filled with afternoon light. Daniel was waiting at the end of the corridor, his posture straight but his eyes heavy. When Julia reached him, she handed him the envelope. "It's done," she said simply. He didn't open it. He just looked at her. His mother standing there, smaller than he remembered, but unbroken. For the first time since the fire, he took her hand. "Let's go home, Mom." And together they walked out of the hospital, leaving behind the ghosts of what used to be a family. The Bennett house stood still for days after Julia and Daniel returned from the hospital. The scent of smoke had faded, but its memory lingered in the walls like a warning. Every corner carried echoes of a life that no longer existed, a marriage turned to ash, a family fractured beyond repair. Julia moved through the house quietly, methodically. She stripped the bedsheets, boxed the framed photographs, and emptied Julian's closet without ceremony. She didn't cry. She simply folded each shirt, each tie, and placed them neatly into bags for donation. Her hands had done this kind of work all her life, baking, cleaning, fixing, and they didn't need emotion to keep moving. When she reached the top shelf of the closet, she found an old photo album covered in dust. The cover was cracked, the edges curled. She sat on the floor and opened it, the scent of age and paper rising faintly. There they were, two young faces, smiling at the camera, her in a white dress, Julian in his navy suit. The first page was filled with promises. The last was filled with strangers. She traced her younger self with one trembling finger. That girl had believed in forever. That girl hadn't known how betrayal could hollow a person from the inside out. The sound of footsteps pulled her back. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. He had been quiet since the hospital, working long hours, eating little, sleeping less. His uniform jacket hung loosely on him now. "You don't have to do all this tonight," he said. Julia shook her head. "If I don't, I'll never finish." He watched her pack another box, the air heavy between them. "The bakery called," he said after a moment. "They want you to come in tomorrow. Orders are backing up again." She smiled faintly. "Good. Work is simpler than people." Daniel's mouth twitched in something like agreement, but he didn't leave. He looked around the room that had once belonged to both his parents, the framed wedding photo now missing from the wall, the empty dresser, the bed stripped to its mattress. "It feels wrong," he said quietly. "Like the house is grieving, too." Julia closed the box and sealed it with tape. Maybe it is. Later that night, she sat alone in the kitchen. The same table, the same clock ticking on the wall, but everything else felt foreign. The air was too still, the silence too deep. She poured herself a cup of tea, her fingers wrapping around the warmth. For the first time, she let herself think about what came next. Divorce was freedom, yes, but it was also emptiness. After 40 years of building a life around someone else, she didn't quite know how to exist in the quiet. The front door creaked open. Daniel came in his boots, heavy on the tile. "I thought you were asleep," she said. "Couldn't," he murmured. He sat down across from her, rubbing the back of his neck. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice low. "I keep seeing it. That day. Them. I wish I didn't." Julia reached across the table and took his hand. "You can't unsee the truth, Daniel. You can only live past it." He looked up at her, his face lined with exhaustion. "Do you ever regret it? Doing what you did?" She was quiet for a long moment. The steam from her tea curled upward like a secret trying to escape. "No," she said finally. "I regret what made it necessary." Daniel nodded, slowly understanding, without approval. "I filed for the divorce this morning," he said. Allison signed. "She's moving out of town." Julia felt the smallest wave of relief pass through her chest. "Good. That chapter's closed." "She asked me for forgiveness," Daniel added. "And what did you tell her I said I'd think about it?" Julia studied his face, his father's eyes, her stubbornness, the grief of both. "That's fair," she said softly. He exhaled and leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet, washed in the pale glow of the porch light. "It's strange," he murmured. "Even after everything, I still miss her sometimes." Julia smiled sadly. "Missing someone doesn't mean you want them back. It just means your heart remembers what your mind knows better than to trust." For a while, they sat in silence. The clock ticked. The world moved on. The next morning, Julia walked into her bakery as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The regulars greeted her with warm smiles, pretending not to know, pretending not to whisper. Behind the counter, the smell of fresh bread wrapped around her like a balm. Morning, Mrs. Bennett said Marcy, her young assistant. "We've got 3 new orders from the hotel downtown." "Good," Julia said, tying her apron. "Let's get to work." She rolled dough kneaded shaped baked. Her muscles remembered what her heart forgot. The steady rhythm of her hands was an anchor, something pure, uncorrupted. Each loaf that rose from the oven felt like a small reclaiming of herself. When the rush was over, Daniel arrived, sleeves rolled up, ready to help with deliveries. He smiled at her, tired but genuine. "You look like you again," he said. She wiped flour from her hands. "Maybe I am." As he loaded the van, Julia stood at the bakery window and looked out at the town waking up. People passing by nodded, waved, smiled. Life was moving forward. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel trapped in her story. She wasn't someone's wife or someone's victim. She was just Julia Bennett, the woman who survived the fire and kept baking anyway. The oven dinged softly behind her. She turned, lifted out a tray of golden flan, and set it on the counter. The scent of caramel filled the air, warm and sweet, and for a fleeting moment, she felt something like peace. By the time spring came to Austin, the scars of scandal had begun to fade from the neighborhood. The whispers quieted, the stares softened. People still remembered, of course, they always would, but they stopped looking at Julia with pity and started looking at her with something closer to awe. The bakery was thriving. Each morning, the smell of warm bread spilled onto the street as the sun rose over the town square. Tourists lined up outside before she even opened, drawn in by stories of the woman who rebuilt her life from ashes. Julia smiled at the rumor, but she didn't believe in fairy tales anymore. Survival wasn't glorious. It was steady, lonely work. Daniel worked beside her most days, his energy subdued but dependable. The bond between them had grown quiet and strong, like a bridge built from shared pain. They rarely spoke of Julian or Allison anymore. Some things were best left buried. One evening, after closing, Julia wiped the flour from the counter while Daniel finished counting the register. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between them. She looked at him, the downward tilt of his shoulders, the lines forming near his eyes, and saw a reflection of herself. "You need to take a day off," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "You sound like Dad." Julia froze for a second. The name still carried an ache, though dulled by time. "He used to say that to you?" "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "Before everything." He set the ledger aside. "It's strange. I don't even know which memories are real anymore. I look back and I can't tell if I'm remembering him as he was or as I wanted him to be." Julia dried her hands on a towel. "Maybe both. We all rewrite the people we lose. It's how we survive them." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the window where the late light turned the street gold. "Do you think he regrets it?" Julia paused. "Regret's easy when the consequences have already arrived. He'll live with the shame, but that's not the same as redemption." Daniel didn't answer. He simply gathered the receipts, placed them in a folder, and turned off the light above the register. They locked up together in silence, stepping out into the cool evening air. The bakery sign Bennett's Bread swayed gently in the breeze. Julia looked up at it, remembering the night she painted it with Julian's help all those years ago. His laugh had filled the air, his hands smudged with white paint. She had believed that moment was the beginning of forever. Now it was just another memory she'd learned to live with. As they reached the car, Daniel's phone buzzed. He frowned and looked down. "It's from the hospital," he said quietly. "They said Dad wants to see us." Julia's stomach tightened. "Us?" He nodded. "He's being discharged next week. He asked for both of us." She wanted to say no immediately, to close the door on that part of her life forever. But then she saw the uncertainty in Daniel's face, the need for some kind of ending. "All right," she said finally. "We'll go." The hospital smelled the same as it had weeks ago, sterile and tired. Julian sat propped up in bed, his hair thinner, his frame smaller. The arrogance that once clung to him had withered away, leaving behind a man who looked lost. Daniel stood beside Julia, hands shoved into his pockets. "You wanted to see us." Julian nodded slowly, his voice rasped by age and shame. "I needed to say something before you go on pretending I'm already dead." Julia folded her arms, waiting. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For everything. For betraying you. For ruining our family. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to hear it." Silence settled over the room like dust. Julia watched him, searching for sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in years she saw a flicker of it. But it didn't matter anymore. His apology was too small, too late, like rain falling on a house already burned down. "I forgive you," she said quietly. Julian looked up, startled. "I forgive you," she repeated, "because carrying hate is heavier than carrying grief." He opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes glistened. Daniel stood rigid beside her, torn between anger and compassion. "Take care of yourself," Julia said, turning toward the door. She didn't look back as she left, and that was her real forgiveness, not staying, not arguing, not reliving the pain again, just leaving it where it belonged. That night, back at the bakery, Julia stood alone by the window as the city lights blinked in the distance. Daniel had gone home early, exhausted, but she couldn't bring herself to rest. She thought about all the versions of herself that had lived within these walls, the young dreamer, the devoted wife, the betrayed woman, and now the survivor. She realized for the first time that she no longer felt anger when she thought of Julian. What she felt instead was something softer, pity perhaps, or release. The clock above the counter ticked the same one that had marked every hour of her old life. Its sound no longer accused her. It simply kept time the way life does. Julia reached for a clean apron and hung it neatly on the hook, ready for tomorrow. The scent of baked bread lingered in the air, warm and steady, the scent of continuity. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the window pane in a rhythm that was neither mournful nor hopeful, just true. And for the first time in a long time, Julia Bennett exhaled without pain. Summer came quietly that year. The days stretched long and golden, and the air carried the sweet heaviness of blooming magnolia trees. For the first time in months, Julia Bennett didn't wake up to the sound of her own heartbeat pounding against the silence. The storm had passed. What remained was stillness, a fragile, unfamiliar peace. The bakery had become the heart of her new life. Customers came and went, filling the small shop with laughter, gossip, and the steady rhythm of ordinary days. Julia moved among them with a calm grace flower dusting her apron, her hair pinned neatly back. People often told her she seemed stronger now. She only smiled. They didn't understand that strength wasn't something she gained, it was something she finally stopped giving away. Every morning, Daniel joined her before dawn. They worked in sync, kneading, shaping, baking, rarely speaking, yet always connected. The quiet between them was comfortable now. Where grief had once settled, understanding had grown. One afternoon after closing, Julia wiped the counter and looked out at the empty tables. "It's been a year," she said softly. Daniel glanced up from stacking boxes. "Since what?" "Since the fire," she replied. Her voice held no bitterness, only reflection. He nodded slowly. "Feels longer." Julia smiled faintly. Maybe that's a good thing. They didn't talk about Julian anymore. After his release from the hospital, he had sold what little he owned and moved to another city. A mutual acquaintance mentioned he was living alone in a small apartment near Dallas, his health failing but his mind still sharp enough to remember every mistake. Julia never reached out. Some stories didn't need epilogues. As for Allison, she had left Texas entirely. Daniel received divorce papers in the mail, neatly signed and notarized with no note attached. He burned them behind the bakery, watching the smoke curl upward until it vanished into the sky. That was the only ceremony their marriage would ever have. Late one evening, after Daniel left for his night shift at the station, Julia walked through the quiet house. The walls were different now, painted soft cream stripped of photographs. She didn't want reminders of faces that once smiled falsely. On the mantel sat only a single framed picture, Daniel as a boy covered in flour, laughing beside a tray of half-burned muffins that she decided was family enough. She made herself a cup of tea and stepped outside. The sky was wide and star-dusted, the kind of Texas night that wrapped you in both loneliness and comfort. Fireflies blinked in the grass, small lights moving without purpose, yet beautiful in their wandering. Julia sat on the porch steps, the wood cool beneath her bare feet. The air carried a faint scent of vanilla from the bakery across the street. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. She thought about the woman she had been, the one who believed loyalty could fix anything, who confused endurance with love. That woman had burned down with the lies she once built her world upon. What rose from the ashes wasn't revenge, not really. It was clarity. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The next morning, Julia woke before sunrise and walked to the bakery early, leaving the lights off. The dawn light spilled through the front windows in shades of peach and gold. She tied her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and began to bake, just as she always had, just as she always would. As she whisked the sugar into the caramel, she hummed softly an old tune her mother used to sing while cooking. The melody filled the empty room, weaving through the scent of warm butter and sweet cream. When Daniel arrived, she was already placing trays of flan in the glass display. "You're early," he said, smiling. "I couldn't sleep," she replied without turning around. "Thought I'd start the day." He watched her for a moment, then picked up a towel and began to help. "We got a catering request from the Grand Hotel again," he said. "They want an extra shipment this weekend." "Tell them yes," she said. "We'll manage." "You sure you're not overworking yourself?" Julia looked up at him, her eyes warm but firm. "Daniel, after everything we've been through, a little work isn't going to break me." He laughed softly. Fair enough. They moved together in easy rhythm, the clatter of trays and the hum of the oven filling the air. Outside, the first customers were already forming a line. By mid-morning, sunlight poured through the windows, glinting off the polished counter. A little girl pressed her nose against the glass, staring at the rows of pastries with wonder. Julia waved her inside and offered her a cookie. The girl's mother smiled gratefully. For a fleeting moment, Julia saw her younger self in that child, curious, hopeful, unbroken. It filled her with a quiet kind of joy. As the bell over the door chimed again and again, Julia realized something she hadn't felt in years. Life had continued without permission. It hadn't waited for her grief to settle or her wounds to heal. It simply moved forward, carrying her with it, and she was finally ready to go along. That afternoon, after the last customer left, Julia locked up the bakery and stood by the window watching the sunlight fade. The town outside pulsed with life cars' laughter, the smell of fresh rain on hot pavement. She placed her hand on the glass, the warmth of the day still clinging to it. Her reflection stared back at her older, wiser, softer. The woman who had once lived in shadows was gone. Julia Bennett was free.